Are you lost, Grandpa? The voice, sharp and laced with a manufactured authority, cut through the quiet hum of the climate-controlled corridor. It belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Vance, a man whose crisp, new uniform seemed to carry more starch than his character. He stood with his arms crossed, a knot of younger, sycophantic officers flanking him like pilot fish on a shark. His target was the old man methodically pushing a mop and bucket down the gleaming white floor of the C-4ISR wing, the nerve center of Creech Air Force Base. The old man didn't look up. He continued his work, the worn wooden handle of the mop moving in a slow, rhythmic figure-8 pattern. His hands, gnarled and thick-knuckled like the roots of an old oak, guided the tool with an economy of motion that spoke of decades of practice. He wore simple gray janitor's overalls, faded at the knees and stained with the ghosts of 1,000 other tasks. His name tag, clipped askew on his pocket, just said Silas. "I'm talking to you, old-timer." Vance pressed, his voice louder now, performing for his audience. He took a step forward, his polished Corfam boots squeaking on the immaculate floor. "This is a restricted area. The C4ISR Fusion Center. We deal in real-time, multi-domain operations here. This isn't the bingo hall at the VFW. So what are you doing here?" Silas paused his mopping. He dipped the graying mop head into the bucket of water, the sound echoing slightly in the otherwise silent hall. He lifted it, expertly wrung it out against the metal press, and only then did he slowly straighten up. His back complained with a soft groan, but his posture, once upright, was surprisingly straight. He finally turned his head, and for the first time, Vance saw his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, like a winter sky, and set in a face that was a roadmap of wrinkles and sun damage. Yet, those eyes were shockingly clear, and they seemed to take in everything. Vance's arrogant posture, the nervous shifting of the junior officers, the precise location of the security cameras, all in a single, placid glance. "Cleaning the floor, sir," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble, with a faint, unplaceable drawl from somewhere in the heartland. It was calm, factual, and held not a trace of the subservience or fear Vance had expected. One of the young lieutenants snickered. Vance's lips curled into a smirk. "Cleaning the floor. Right." With that antique, he gestured dismissively at the mop. "Did you get that from a museum? We have automated floor scrubbers for this. High-tech solutions for a high-tech force. We don't have time for this kind of manual inefficiency." Silas looked down at his mop as if seeing it for the first time. The wood was dark and smooth from years of handling. "It still works," he stated simply. "I'm sure it does, Pops. But that's not the point," Vance said, stepping closer until he was invading the old man's personal space. The smell of his expensive, spicy cologne clashed with the simple, clean scent of the floor soap. "The point is standards. Presentation. We are the tip of the spear. We project power through technology and precision. Everything about this wing is supposed to reflect that. And you do not reflect that." He let the insult hang in the air. Among the junior officers, a young airman first class named Davis shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the floor. He was a cyber systems specialist, barely 20 years old, and this whole confrontation felt deeply wrong to him. He'd seen the old man around for the past few days, always quiet, always working, always with a gentle nod for anyone who passed. There was a stillness about him, a dignity that this loud, preening colonel was trying to shatter. Silas didn't react. He simply stood there, patient as a stone, his hands resting on the mop handle. His silence seemed to infuriate Vance more than any argument could have. The colonel was used to deference, to people snapping to attention. This quiet, unmovable presence was a challenge to his entire worldview, which equated rank and volume with respect. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Vance snapped, his voice losing its mocking tone and gaining a harder edge. Silas slowly lifted his gaze from the floor and met the colonel's eyes again. There was no anger, no fear. There was just observation. It was unnerving. It felt to Vance like he was the one being scrutinized, weighed, and measured. "I don't have time for this," Vance declared, making a show of glancing at his expensive, multi-function digital watch. "We have a simulated drone recovery mission briefing in 5. I want you and your relic out of this corridor. Now, go find a supply closet to nap in." He turned his back on Silas, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He started to lead his entourage down the hall, his voice already booming again as he started explaining the technical parameters of the upcoming exercise. The MQ-9's data link is encrypted with the new SY-500 algorithm, which means latency is down to a sub-2 millisecond range. It's a thing of beauty. You won't see that kind of tech in the civilian world for another decade. Behind him, Silas watched them go. He didn't move. He just stood, his gnarled hands gripping the familiar wood of the mop handle. He wasn't looking at the colonel. He was looking at the young airman, Davis, who had risked a quick glance back, his face a mask of discomfort and apology. Silas gave a barely perceptible nod, a small acknowledgement that he had seen the young man's decency. Then, he dipped his mop back into the water and went back to work, the rhythmic swish-swish on the white floor the only sound that remained. He had a job to do. Vance, feeling the lingering weight of the old man's silent defiance, couldn't let it go. He stopped about 20 feet down the hall, his lecture on data link encryption tapering off. He needed to re-establish his dominance, to put the final punctuation on the encounter. He turned, a cruel idea sparking in his eyes. He was holding a state-of-the-art, self-heating travel mug, emblazoned with the unit's insignia. "Oh, whoops," he said with theatrical clumsiness. He tilted the mug, and a stream of dark, hot coffee cascaded onto the pristine white section of floor Silas had just finished cleaning. The liquid pooled, steaming slightly in the cool air. The lieutenants behind him fell silent, sensing the shift from casual mockery to deliberate cruelty. This was no longer just arrogance. It was a targeted act of humiliation. "Clumsy me," Vance said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. He walked back toward Silas, his boots stopping just short of the puddle. He looked down at the mess, then up at the old man. "Looks like you missed a spot, Pops. You'd better get that. Don't want anyone to slip and fall. Safety first, right?" Silas looked at the spreading brown stain, then at the colonel's smug face. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in the depths of his pale blue eyes. A shadow, a memory of a different kind of stain on a different kind of floor. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same unnerving calm. He didn't say a word. He slowly wheeled his bucket over, the rubber casters squeaking softly. He bent down, the motion stiff but steady, and began to sop up the coffee with his mop. Vance watched, a triumphant sneer on his face. This was better. This was the proper order of things. The powerful giving orders, the powerless obeying. "Make sure you get all of it," he instructed, as if speaking to a child. "I want to be able to see my reflection in that spot when you're done. Our standards, you know." He gave the side of the metal bucket a light but sharp kick with the toe of his polished boot. The bucket skittered a few inches, sloshing water onto the floor. "Careful there," Vance chuckled. "Wouldn't want to make an even bigger mess." Airman Davis felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't leadership. It was bullying. He looked at the colonel, puffed up with his own importance, and then at the old man on his knees, quietly cleaning up a mess made out of pure spite. The injustice of it was a physical weight in his chest. He looked around at the other officers. They were avoiding eye contact, some studying the ceiling, others their phones, all of them complicit in their silence. They were afraid of the colonel, afraid of damaging their careers by speaking up for a janitor. Silas finished absorbing the coffee. He wrung the dirty mop head out, the dark liquid swirling into the clean water. As he reached for the mop again to do a final pass, the glint of light off the polished toe of Vance's boot, the one that had kicked his bucket, caught his eye. It was a brilliant, perfect shine, a mirror finish without a single scuff. And the hallway dissolved. The sterile white corridor melted away into a maelstrom of dust, smoke, and the copper tang of blood. The cool, conditioned air was replaced by the oppressive, searing heat of a Somali afternoon. He wasn't on his knees on a polished floor. He was kneeling in the cramped, buckled fuselage of a downed MH-60 Black Hawk. The rhythmic swish of the mop was gone, replaced by the deafening roar of nearby gunfire and the desperate screams of wounded men. His hands, now 30 years younger but just as steady, were not holding a mop. They were pressed deep into the mangled thigh of a young ranger, a kid no older than Airman Davis. The boy's leg was a ruin of flesh and bone, and the floor of the helicopter was slick with his lifeblood. "Stay with me, son. Look at me." Silas's voice was different then, a harsh, commanding bark that cut through the chaos. He wasn't Silas the janitor. He was Ghost, the call sign whispered in awe and reverence by the operators he supported. His gnarled hands, now firm and powerful, worked with practiced urgency. He ignored the bullets punching through the thin skin of the aircraft. He packed the wound with quick clot, his movements precise and economical, wasting nothing. The young ranger's eyes were wide with panic, his breathing ragged. "It's okay," Ghost told him, his voice softening just enough. "I've got you. Just a little pressure. You're going home." The reflection in the pool of blood on the helicopter floor wasn't a smug colonel. It was his own face, younger, harder, covered in grime and sweat, but with the same pale, clear eyes. Eyes that had seen hell and refused to blink. He had held that boy's hand, kept him from bleeding out for 2 long hours until the rescue convoy finally broke through. He had saved his life not with a multi-million-dollar drone or an encrypted data link, but with his hands, a $5 field dressing, and an unbreakable will. A blink, the memory vanished. The roar of combat faded back into the quiet hum of the air conditioner. The smell of blood and cordite was gone, replaced by the faint aroma of coffee and floor cleaner. He was Silas again, an old man in gray overalls, kneeling on a floor in Nevada. His hands, now wrinkled and spotted with age, were holding a simple mop, but they were just as steady. He took a slow, deep breath, the air filling his lungs. He finished cleaning the spot, leaving the white towel spotless, just as the colonel had demanded. He rose to his feet, the motion deliberate. He looked at Vance, who was still preening, enjoying his victory. Airman Davis couldn't stand it a second longer. His grandfather had been a master sergeant in Vietnam. He'd been raised on stories of quiet professionals, of leaders who ate last and looked after their people, no matter their rank or job. This was the opposite of everything he had been taught the uniform stood for. His heart pounding, he made a decision. He muttered an excuse about needing to use the restroom and peeled away from the group of officers, slipping down a side corridor. He pulled out his personal cell phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through his contacts. He didn't have a general's number, but he had the next best thing. He had the direct line for the command chief master sergeant of the base, a man known for his fierce advocacy for his enlisted airmen and his no-nonsense attitude. He'd gotten the number during an orientation briefing, with the chief's explicit instruction to call if he ever saw something that was fundamentally wrong, disqualified. He pressed the call button. "Chief's office, Sergeant Miller speaking," a crisp voice answered. "Sergeant," Davis said, keeping his voice low. "This is Airman First Class Davis at the C4ISR wing. I need to speak with the chief. It's an emergency. Is someone injured, Airman?" "No, Sergeant. It's a matter of conduct. Lieutenant Colonel Vance he's publicly humiliating one of the civilian janitorial staff. An old man. He's being cruel, and something about it is just wrong. Sir, you told us to call." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Davis could picture the sergeant on duty rolling his eyes at an airman complaining about an officer. But then the sergeant's tone shifted. "An old man? The janitor? Describe him." "Elderly, sir. Gray overalls. Quiet. Name tag just says Silas," Davis whispered. The silence on the other end of the line was suddenly heavy, absolute. When Sergeant Miller spoke again, all traces of bureaucratic routine were gone. His voice was tight with shock and something that sounded like panic. "Airman, where exactly are you?" he asked, his voice sharp and urgent. "Main corridor, 3rd floor of the C4ISR building, just outside the fusion center. Stay where you are. Do not engage. Do not say a word. The chief is on his way. God help us all." The line went dead. Back in the main corridor, Vance was preparing for his final act. He was bored with the silent old man and wanted to get to his briefing. He needed a final, definitive display of his power. He strode back over to Silas, who was now standing patiently by his bucket. Vance reached out and snatched the simple, plastic-clipped ID from Silas's overalls. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of garbage. "Silas Kane," he read aloud with mocking condescension. "That's it. No rank, no title, just Silas. From A1 Janitorial Services," he scoffed and looked at his officers. "You know, I did my time. I served. I pushed myself, went for the promotions, took the hard assignments. That's how you build a life of honor, of pride. You don't end up like this. He gestured vaguely at Silas's entire existence. What did you even do when you were in, old-timer? If you even served? Peel potatoes? File paperwork? For the first time since the confrontation began, Silas's expression changed. A deep, profound sadness filled his eyes. It wasn't sadness for himself, but for the uniformed man standing before him, so full of arrogance and so utterly blind. He finally looked directly at Vance, and his voice, though still quiet, carried a new weight, a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the hallway. I served, he said simply. The two words were not an answer. They were a statement of fact, as plain and solid as bedrock. They held the weight of jungles and deserts, of whispered orders in the dead of night, of promises kept to fallen comrades. They contained a history so vast and so secret that Lieutenant Colonel Vance, with all his technical knowledge and advanced degrees, could not even begin to comprehend it. The words hung in the air, a quiet rebuke to the colonel's loud-mouthed insecurity. Vance, however, heard only a pathetic, minimalist defense. It enraged him. You served? That's the best you've got? He snarled, stepping forward, his hand balling into a fist. He was about to grab the old man by the collar of his overalls, to physically remove him, to finally break his infuriating calm. It was at that exact moment that every light in the corridor flashed red. A klaxon began to blare, a jarring, urgent sound that signified a real-world, highest-priority threat. The calm, sterile environment of the C4ISR wing was instantly shattered. Down the hall, in the glass-walled fusion center, technicians began scrambling, their voices rising in alarm. Sir, we've lost contact with UAS-7, a voice shouted from within the center. What do you mean, lost contact? Vance yelled, his attention instantly snapping from Silas to the crisis. I mean, it's gone, sir. Datalink is dead. Satellite feed is dark. It's just a ghost. Vance rushed into the fusion center, the junior officers trailing behind him, their earlier bravado forgotten. Silas was left alone in the corridor, the red emergency lights washing over his weathered face. He looked at the chaos unfolding in the high-tech command room. Vance was shouting orders, but there was panic in his voice. He was a man who understood the systems when they worked, but had no idea what to do when they broke. Reroute through the STARS relay. Try the alternate frequency. Vance commanded. Negative, sir. There's nothing there. It's like the bird just vanished from the sky. And, sir, we're getting something else. A massive cyber attack. Our firewalls are being bypassed. They're inside our network. The atmosphere in the room went from panicked to terrified. This wasn't a simulation. This was real. A billion-dollar drone, one of their most advanced surveillance assets, had been electronically hijacked, and their own secure network was compromised. Vance's face went pale. His entire career, his reputation, was flashing before his eyes. He was the commander on duty. This was his failure. He stared blankly at the main screen, which now showed a cascade of error codes and intrusion alerts. He was frozen, paralyzed by the scale of a crisis his training had never prepared him for. Through the glass, Silas watched the young colonel crumble. He saw the fear replace the arrogance. He saw a leader lost in the storm. With a soft sigh, he set his mop carefully against the wall. He walked calmly to the door of the fusion center, which slid open automatically for him. He stepped inside. The technicians were too panicked to notice the old janitor walking onto their command floor. Vance, however, saw him out of the corner of his eye. Get out of here, he shrieked, his voice cracking. We have a real-world situation. I don't have time for it. His voice trailed off as Silas walked right past him. The old man moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. He approached the main console, where the lead technician, a young sergeant, was sweating and typing furiously with no result. Move, Silas said. The word was not a request. It was a quiet, absolute command. The sergeant, startled, looked up at the old janitor. For a second, he was about to object, but he saw the look in the old man's pale blue eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the eyes of battle-hardened Special Forces operators who sometimes passed through the base. It was an expression of total focus and absolute competence. Without a word, the sergeant slid his chair back. Silas sat down. The chair groaned under his weight. His gnarled, arthritic hands, the hands Vance had mocked, hovered over the keyboard for a moment. They looked clumsy, out of place above the sleek, glowing interface. Then they moved. They didn't type. They danced. They flew across the keys with a speed and precision that was simply impossible. His fingers, which had looked so stiff and slow while holding a mop, were a blur of motion. He wasn't just typing commands. He was writing code on the fly. Lines of text scrolled across the screen at a dizzying rate, far faster than the system was designed to display. He ignored the mouse, his hands never leaving the keyboard, navigating through complex directories and subroutines with arcane shortcuts that hadn't been in a technical manual for decades. What is he doing? One of the lieutenants whispered in awe. Vance stared, his mouth agape. That's a root-level command prompt. Access is restricted to the network architects at DARPA. You can't even get to that screen from here. Silas paid them no mind. He was in his element. The chaos of the room faded away, just as the chaos of the Black Hawk crash had. There was only the problem and the solution. His eyes scanned the cascading data, not reading it line by line, but absorbing it in patterns. It's a piggyback virus, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Rides in on the drone's handshake protocol. Hides in the latency buffer. Clever. He typed a rapid series of commands. A new window opened on the screen, a simple, text-based interface that looked like something from the 1980s. He's accessing the system's machine code. Airman Davis breathed from the doorway, his eyes wide with disbelief. That's not even a programming language. That's the raw language of the processor itself. Nobody can do that. Silas's fingers continued their impossible ballet. They're trying to force a cascade failure. Make it look like a system crash. But they want the drone, he muttered. He isolated the malicious code, trapping it in a virtual sandbox he had just constructed from scratch. Then, he began to write a counter-virus. He didn't use any of the advanced anti-malware suites the Air Force had spent billions on. He was fighting the intrusion with its own logic, turning the attacker's code against itself. He found the drone's true signal, a technician exclaimed, pointing to a tiny blip of light that had appeared on a secondary monitor. It's being masked by a ghost signal generator, but he's filtering it out. How is he filtering it out? He's not, Silas said quietly, without looking up from his work. I'm listening to the silence between the bits. The ghost signal is loud. The real signal is quiet. You just have to know how to listen. With a final, deft series of keystrokes, he uploaded his counter-virus. On the main screen, the cascade of error messages stopped. The intrusion alerts vanished. The malicious code, trapped and dismantled, was erased from the system. A moment later, the main screen flickered and the high-definition video feed from UAS-7 snapped back on, showing the calm desert landscape from 30,000 feet. The data link icon turned from red to a solid, healthy green. The entire fusion center was dead silent. The technicians and officers stared at the screens, then at the old man in the janitor's overalls who was sitting at their main console. He had just single-handedly defeated a sophisticated, nation-state-level cyber attack and recovered a billion-dollar asset in less than 3 minutes. Using a keyboard. Silas leaned back in the chair, a soft sigh escaping his lips. He looked at the restored feed on the screen, gave a small, satisfied nod, and then slowly, stiffly, pushed himself up from the chair. He turned to the stunned lead technician. You should run a full diagnostic. And I recommend you update your handshake protocol. The one you're using is 30 years old. He started to walk out of the room, his job done. He was heading back to his mop and bucket. It was then that the doors to the corridor slid open with a hiss, revealing 2 armed security forces airmen snapping to attention. They were flanking a man who wore the 2 stars of a major general on his shoulders and the thunderous expression of a gathering storm on his face. He was the base commander, Major General Marcus Thorne. Trailing him, looking pale and terrified, was the command chief master sergeant who had taken Airman Davis's call. Thorne's eyes swept the room, taking in the relieved but bewildered faces of the technicians, the ghost-white face of Lieutenant Colonel Vance, and finally, the old man in the gray overalls who was about to walk past him. Thorne's furious expression vanished, replaced instantly by one of profound shock, which then morphed into something else entirely, reverence. He ignored Lieutenant Colonel Vance completely. He took 2 sharp steps forward, planting himself directly in Silas's path. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. In the stunned silence of the C-4ISR wing, Major General Thorne, the commander of the entire base, executed the sharpest, most perfect, most respectful salute of his entire career. He did not salute Lieutenant Colonel Vance. He did not salute any of the other officers. He saluted the janitor. General Kane, Thorne said, his voice ringing with an authority that dwarfed Vance's earlier posturing. Sir, I am so sorry. I came as soon as I heard. A collective gasp went through the room. The technicians, the lieutenants, Airman Davis, they all stared, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. Lieutenant Colonel Vance looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His face, already pale, went a shade of gray that matched Silas's overalls. His jaw hung open, and a low, strangled sound escaped his throat. Silas, or General Kane, slowly raised a hand and returned the salute with a weary, practiced gesture. It was not a sharp, parade ground salute, but a simple, tired acknowledgement from one old soldier to another. At ease, Marcus, he said, his voice the same quiet rumble as before. It's just Silas this week. Thorne held his salute for a moment longer before slowly lowering his hand. His eyes, however, were now blazing with cold fury. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, until his gaze fell upon the paralyzed Lieutenant Colonel Vance. Colonel, Thorne began, his voice dangerously quiet. Do you have any idea, any concept at all of the man you have been speaking to for the last hour? Vance shook his head numbly, unable to form words. I didn't think so, Thorne bit out. Because if you did, you would have dug a hole in that floor with your teeth and buried yourself in it. You stand there and you lecture your subordinates about the high-tech force and projection of power, and you don't even recognize the man who built the very ground you're standing on. Thorne took a step toward Vance, his voice rising with every word. This is General Silas Kane. For stars. You see his name on a building at the Academy, the Kane Center for Strategic Studies. You've probably cited his doctoral thesis on asymmetrical warfare without even realizing it. This man was a pioneer of the digital battlefield before you were born. That SY-500 algorithm you were bragging about? He wrote the original architecture for it on a cocktail napkin in a bar in Berlin in 1988 to track ghost submarines. That drone you just lost, and he just recovered? Its core operating system is based on his Ghost protocol, a program so effective and so deeply classified that most of the people who use it don't even know it exists. He wasn't shouting, but the intensity of his voice filled the room, each word a hammer blow against Vance's shattered ego. Let me give you a history lesson, Colonel, since you seem to have missed the important parts. This old-timer, this grandpa, enlisted in the Army in 1968, served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 5th Special Forces Group. He was part of MACV-SOG. Do you know what that is, Colonel? It means he was a ghost, running black ops, so dark the president would deny they ever happened. He was captured. He was tortured. He escaped. He carried 2 wounded comrades 30 miles through enemy jungle to an extraction point. Thorne pointed a trembling finger at Kane. After that, the Army decided he was too valuable to risk in the field, so they sent him to MIT. He got a PhD in computer science and another in international relations in 4 years. He joined the Air Force. He practically invented the concept of cyber warfare. The very network you are charged with defending? He laid the foundation for it. During the Cold War, in an incident so classified it is known only as a silent echo, his work single-handedly prevented a full-scale nuclear exchange by exposing a flaw in the Soviet early warning system that would have triggered a false launch. He did it from a concrete bunker with a computer that had less processing power than your watch. The room was utterly silent, save for Thorne's voice and the soft hum of the now-secure servers. Airman Davis stared at Silas, at the quiet old man who had nodded at him in the hallway, and tried to reconcile that image with the living legend being described. And the medals? Thorne continued, his voice thick with emotion. Let's talk about the medals you can't see on those overalls. He holds the Medal of Honor for his actions in Vietnam. He refused to have it presented publicly because he said he was just doing his job. He has 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, 4 Silver Stars, 6 Bronze Stars for Valor, 8 Purple Hearts. He has been wounded in the service of this country more times than you have celebrated birthdays, Colonel. Thorne finally paused, taking a deep breath. He walked over to Silas and stood beside him, placing a hand on the old general's shoulder. And for the past 15 years, since his official retirement, he has served as a special advisor to the Joint Chiefs. Every year, he picks one base, one command, and he spends a week working there, undercover. Not as a general, but as a cook, a mechanic, a groundskeeper, or a janitor. He does it, he says, because the view from the top is filtered. He wants to see the force from the bottom up. He wants to see if the chain of command is still healthy. He wants to see if our leaders still remember how to lead with respect. Today, Colonel Vance, you gave him his answer. Thorne turned his gaze back to Vance. It was not angry anymore. It was worse. It was a look of cold, profound disappointment. You are a disgrace to that uniform, and you are an embarrassment to my command. Vance finally collapsed. The strength went out of his legs, and he staggered back against a console, his face buried in his hands. A dry, wretched sob escaped his lips. His career, his pride, his entire sense of self had been dismantled and incinerated in the space of 5 minutes. He wasn't just going to be fired. He was going to be a cautionary tale, a legend of failure whispered in the halls of the Pentagon for decades. Major General Thorne looked at the broken man. "Command Chief," he said to the NCO behind him, "relieve Colonel Vance of his command, effective immediately. Confine him to his quarters. His career in the United States Air Force is over." The Chief Master Sergeant nodded grimly and started to move toward Vance. But then, a quiet voice stopped him. "No." Everyone turned. It was General Kane. He had watched the entire tirade with that same sad, patient expression. He stepped forward, his old boots scuffing softly on the floor he had so recently cleaned. He stood before the weeping lieutenant colonel. "He's not a disgrace, Marcus," Silas said, his voice gentle. "He's a product of the system we built. A system that sometimes teaches our best and brightest to value technology over people and rank over respect." He looked down at Vance. "He's just a boy, full of pride and new toys. He's forgotten that the hardware is useless without the heartware." Kane placed a gnarled hand on Vance's shoulder. The colonel flinched, then looked up, his eyes red and full of shame. He saw no anger in the old general's face. He saw no triumph. He saw only a deep, grandfatherly compassion that was more humbling than any punishment. "Your lesson today, son, isn't about saluting a 4-star general in disguise," Silas said softly. "It's about the person you don't see, the person you assume is beneath you. The airman who stocks the parts, the cook who serves the chow, the man who mops the floor. They are the foundation of this entire enterprise. Without them, your data links and your drones are just expensive paperweights. Respect is a currency that flows down, not up. You don't demand it with your rank. You earn it with your character." He turned to a stunned Major General Thorne. "Marcus, I want you to rescind that order. He's not relieved of command permanently. Just for 1 week." He looked back at Vance. "For the next 7 days, your new assignment is with me. You'll be issued a set of gray overalls. We have every latrine in this wing to scrub, and I expect to be able to see my reflection in the porcelain when we're done. Our standards, you know." A choked sob of disbelief and gratitude escaped Vance's lips. It was a punishment, yes, but it was also an act of profound grace. A chance for redemption he did not deserve. 1 month later, things at Creech Air Force Base were different. A new, mandatory training module was being rolled out across Air Combat Command. It was called the Kane Doctrine, Service and Humility. It used the anonymized story of a senior officer and a janitor to teach the importance of foundational respect. In a quiet server room in the C4ISR wing, Lieutenant Colonel Vance, now back in command, was not shouting orders. He was kneeling on the floor next to Airman First Class Davis. A cooling fan on a critical server rack had failed, and Davis was explaining the intricate workaround he'd devised. Vance wasn't looking at his watch or talking about high-level strategy. He was just listening, really listening, to the young airman. He held a flashlight steady for him, his hands, now free of their arrogant stiffness, surprisingly helpful. He had spent a week scrubbing floors and toilets alongside a living legend, listening to quiet stories not of war and glory, but of service, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of a job well done. He was a changed man. As for General Silas Kane, he was gone. His week was up, and he had vanished as quietly as he had appeared. leaving behind only a freshly cleaned corridor and a lesson that would echo for a generation. In his final report to the Joint Chiefs, he made only 2 recommendations. The first was a complete overhaul of the C4ISR handshake protocol. The second was a quiet, personal commendation for a young airman first class named Davis for demonstrating moral courage and upholding the highest traditions of the service. That commendation, a simple letter with a single, scrawled signature, was now framed on Davis's wall, worth more to him than any medal. The story of the general who mopped the floors became a quiet legend, a piece of institutional folklore. It served as a permanent reminder that true strength isn't measured in rank or technology, but in humility and character, and that the greatest heroes are often the ones you don't see at all. They are the foundation, the quiet professionals who simply and profoundly serve. The impact of such stories reminds us all that there is greatness hidden everywhere, and that treating every person with dignity is a duty we all share. If you believe in the power of these hidden heroes and want to hear more tales of honor and redemption, make sure to subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear it.